Here's what I'm going to do. Let's stand up for the reading of God's word. It's going to be me. Usually it's somebody else, but I'm going to read it. And we're going to walk through the next 6 weeks the life of David. And I love the life of David because we get to see not just what he did, but also how he thought and how he felt through the Psalms. And so each week we'll have two different texts. So I'll put them on the screen for us. And as I read them, we'll then thank the Lord and we'll get moving. So 1 Samuel 22. Verses 1-2 and Psalm 57, verses 1-3. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all of his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. And he became commander over them, and there were with him about 400 men. Psalm 57, to the choir master, according to do not destroy, a miktam of David when he fled from Saul in the cave. Be merciful to me, O God. Be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge, till the storms of destruction pass by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me, Selah. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. So in light of this Unshaken journey, we want to look at the life of David. David's life has always been fascinating to me. He's, you can't really box him into the type of guy that you think he is. He slayed Goliath. He killed tens of thousands of people. There was literally a song written about how many people he's killed. All right, Saul's killed his thousands, but David has killed his tens of thousands. And so he's this, manly warrior guy, but then in the next minute, he's writing songs and he's writing poetry, right? You don't know what to do with him. He's watching football. He's watching the Lions beat the Cowboys today on TV, right? And he's crushing beer cans on his forehead. And then the next minute, he's, getting another tattoo and he's writing poetry and probably crying. I don't know. This is David. And so I've been fascinated with him, but mainly, I've just always been fascinated with David because of what God said about him, famously, right? That David is a man after my heart, right? God's own heart. And that fascinated me because of who, when you look at his life and you look at some of the things that he did, right? Bathsheba, Uriah, murder, adultery. There's a few things in there where you're like, really? Yeah, a man after God's heart. And I don't think I quite understood it until maybe, 10 or so years ago. Where I was just wrestling, why is David a man after God's own heart? And I think I began to understand it when I began to actually read the Psalms. When the Psalms became the songs of my heart, when the Psalms became my prayer language, and I would get up in the morning and I would just pray through the Psalms, I began to realize, David is a man after God's heart. That it wasn't about what David did right or wrong sometimes. It was what he felt and what he thought and what he did, especially when things were hard. See, I realized that David is a man after God's own heart because in the place of trial, when he's walking through suffering, when he's going through hard times, when he doubts God, he runs to God, not away from him. That David's a man after God's own heart because of when he runs after God. So many of us in those difficult times and seasons, we actually distance ourselves from God. When things are hard, we walk away from God. We begin to doubt God. We begin to question God. We keep him at arm's length. David didn't do that. He chased after the heart of God when things were hard. When he didn't understand, that's when he would all the more run after God. And so he was a man after God's own heart. And so what I wanted to do over the next 6 weeks was to look at some of the ways in which David lived that out. His spiritual life, so to speak. When he surrendered to God, what did that look like? When he was devoted to God, what did that look like? When he trusted God, what did he look like? And that's what I want to talk about this week. David trusted God. Do you trust God? Do you trust God? It's a simple question without a simple answer. There are aspects of all of our lives, there are places in all of our hearts where we don't trust God, where we don't. right? There's places in our life, categories of our life, where if we're honest, we haven't fully given that over to God, where we say we trust him. There's this line in one of the prayers of the Valley of Vision, this prayer book, that has always struck me, where he's praying, he's confessing, and he says, there is still so much unconquered territory in my heart. And so many, like for many of us, we have aspects of our corners of our heart, of our life, that we haven't fully given it up to the Lord. And so let me ask again, do you trust God? Or maybe a better question would be, are there aspects of your life where if you were honest with your heart, you would say, I don't know that I've fully given that over to him, that I don't trust him, that I don't trust him. Because David, we find him in 1 Samuel 22, we find him in a cave, right? He's in a cave. It says that he departed from there and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. He is escaping, running from King Saul, who is trying to kill him. Here's where we find David at this point in his life. He was anointed as king. He has slayed Goliath. He has found himself in the king's palace. He has married the king's daughter. Everything is going well for him, but then the king he's the most famous man in Israel, right? They're singing the songs about him. But then King Saul gets jealous of David and tries to kill him. And so now he's running from Saul. In one moment he was in the king's palace, and the very next moment he's in the wilderness in a cave. Maybe you've experienced a season of life like that, where you're killing it, things are going great, your dreams, they're happening, you went to the school that you thought you'd go to, you've got the job you thought you would have, you have the spouse that you kind of thought that you were gonna kind of maybe have, you know, and everything's going well for you, things are going well as planned, and yet something happens and all of a sudden the plan seems to be diverted. We've all been in that place. That's where David is at. He was on the mountaintop, now he's in the valley. Right? He was in the king's palace, now he's literally in the wilderness in a cave. That's not how we think the Christian life should go. If we're being honest, that's not how we think it should go. We think it should go like the writer of Hebrews writes, right? The writer of Hebrews, he's talking about God's people in the Old Testament in chapter 11, and he says, what more shall we say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, of David, of Samuel and the prophets, who through faith they conquered kingdoms and enforced justice. They obtained promises. They stopped the mouths of lions. They quenched the power of fire. They escaped the edge of the sword. They were made strong out of weakness. They became mighty in war. They put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. We think that's the Christian life, right? We think if we're doing it right, if we're going to the right church, if we're doing the right things, if we have the right faith, if we have enough faith, then this is how life life with Jesus will go. My plans, they will go well. My dreams, I will achieve them. I will have the job that I want to have, the relationships I want to have, and everything will go awesome. But the writer of Hebrews doesn't stop there, right? He goes on, he says, and some were tortured, and others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and in caves of the earth. David, he finds himself in a cave. God's people have spent a lot of their time in caves. Just because you're doing the Christian thing right doesn't mean that your life will always go awesome. God's people have spent a lot of time in the cave. What is the cave? Well, the cave is a place of paradox, right? It's both a place of refuge, but also of trial. Jesus' tomb literally was a cave. So Joseph of Arimathea had his tomb, a rich man's tomb, gives Jesus his tomb. And so they put him in this cave, and it becomes a tomb because he's in there, and then they roll the stone in front of it. That's a cave. Right, so a cave, it's this place of paradox. It's a place where you die to yourself and then you're brought to new life. It's a place of death and resurrection. It's a place of trial, but also a place of refuge, a place of testing, but a place of shelter. It's a place of paradox. It's a place where God brings you, where you surrender everything to him, you trust in him, and then you are resurrected. You're transformed into something new. That's the cave. So God's people, they've spent a lot of time in caves. Obadiah, I know you've memorized Obadiah and you know his life completely. Everybody's memorized Obadiah. He hid 100 prophets in 2 caves to escape death at the hands of Jezebel in 1 Kings 18. In a time of oppression, the Midianites, in a time of oppression from the Midianites, the Israelites made for themselves dens, which are in the mountains and the caves of the strongholds. That's Judges chapter 6. And of course, famously, Elijah hid in a cave from Jezebel as well. And it was in the cave that Elijah heard the gentle whisper of God. Right? God's people spend time in caves. Maybe you have found yourself in a cave. The cave of your depression and anxiety, the cave of your marriage or loneliness or both. And we find ourselves in these caves, these places where it doesn't feel like we're in the king's palace. It feels like we're in the wilderness and it's hard. And we don't understand why. It doesn't seem like this should have been the plan. Why is my life in this place? Aren't I doing the right things? Aren't I trying as hard as I can? I'm doing what you've asked of me, God, right? And yet we find ourselves in a cave. The desert monks in the 3rd through 6th centuries, they almost created a sort of spiritual way about them by going into the caves. They looked at the Bible and they saw how much God did through his people, or in his people, through the cave, that literally, like for hundreds of years, they would find themselves leaving town, leaving cities, and going to the cave to bring about the sort of work in their hearts that they felt like God needed to do. The cave for them was a place of trial, but a place of also trust and transformation. And they developed whole spiritual ways about them in caves. And then if you look in verse 2, who does God bring into the cave? 1 Samuel 22, verse 2, and everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and then everyone who was bitter in soul. Like this was David's city group, right? This was his cave group. His cave group was, a bunch of distressed, debted, embittered people. David's like Robin Hood, okay? I think there's a new Robin Hood movie out or show out or something like that. Go watch the old Kevin Costner one, okay? But David, like all these people, so they're kind of running from the authority. King Saul has not built for himself a very good country. They're not flourishing. Things are not well. His policies and his ways and the way in which he is leading has not gone well. And so there's men and women that are not going well. They find themselves looking for David, who is anointed as the one true king, and they go and look for David and find him in the cave. And so this cave, it's a place where they can find refuge and hopefully new life, right? New life. And David is going to lead them. And so David's on the run. You've got, his life's not going as planned. You've got all these people who are, depressed and distressed and in debt. Their life is not going well. It's not going to be a very clean, neat, pretty group, but here they are, right? Here they are in the cave. Now, here's what we don't know. We don't know much that happens while they're there. We don't know much. I wish there was so much more content around it, because I really want to know. There's a guy I follow in Detroit. I'm from Detroit, and his name is Jason Wilson. He wrote a book called Cry Like a Man. Read that. It's mainly about his story growing up and what God has done in his life. But he was so struck by this same story, right? 2 verses, David in the cave of Adullam, that he went and started a ministry in inner city Detroit where he teaches young kids the MMA, right? So mixed martial arts. He teaches them those things, but in the midst of that, he's actually training them emotionally. He's training them physically, but he's actually training them emotionally. He was so captured by what happened with these, men of distress and embittered and in debt, and they come to David and they come out new men. And so he called it the Cave of Adullam. That's his ministry. There was a ESPN documentary done about it and all of that. Right, it sort of captures you, these 2 verses, but we don't know much about it except for David writes about it in the Psalms. We get a look at his heart. What was he like? What was he thinking about? What was he wrestling with while he was in the cave? And so in Psalm 57, we see what he was wrestling with. In verse 1, He says, be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in you, my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings, I will take refuge. Till the storms of destruction pass by, I will cry out to God Most High. So he looks to God in his heart as he's in the cave. Things have not gone well for him. He's got this, knucklehead group with him. And what was he thinking? What was he feeling? What was he doing? He was praying and trusting in God. He says, you will be my refuge. You are the shadow. You are my refuge. In your shadow, in the shadow of your wings, I find refuge and shelter. One of the things that I love about David is that when he doubts, when he's struggling, he runs towards God. Made me think of Psalm 113, right? How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? But by the end of that psalm, he's saying, but God will deliver me. I trust in God to deliver me. One of the things about doubt that Christians, I don't know, young Christians especially, but Christians in America, in the West, we think that doubt is bad. We think that when we're in a place of doubt, when we find ourselves in the cave, and we don't think God is, doing the right thing, and we're wondering where he is or what we've done, and we find ourselves doubting, we think that's somehow a bad thing. I think doubt is a good thing. I think doubt actually presses you in to your faith. And that's what David is doing here. In the midst of his doubt, he recognizes who God is, what God is like, what God has already done, and he's going to be the same tomorrow as he was yesterday. He says, in you I will take refuge. See, doubt and unbelief are two different things, right? Doubt and unbelief are two different things. Doubt will speak, unbelief stays silent. Doubt will draw near to God when it's wondering. Unbelief distance itself from God. Right? Doubt and unbelief are two different things. Press into your doubt. Let your doubt press you into more faith in God. Unbelief is bitter. Doubt is hopeful. Unbelief doesn't think it's true. Doubt wants it to be true. God, I don't feel like you're near, but I know you're near. But I know you're near. Those are two different things. And so in his doubt, he draws near to the Lord and he says, it's in you that I take refuge. And then I love verse 2. Verse 2, I think, is everything for us. In verse 2, he says, I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He's in the cave, things are not going well, and he says, God, it is you who fulfills his purpose for me. Trusting God does not mean you believe that God will carry out your plans for you. Okay, let me say that again. Trusting God doesn't mean you are believing that God will carry out your plans for you. Trusting God means that you believe God will carry out his purposes for you. That it's his purposes that he will carry out. You trust that his plan is good despite maybe it's contradiction to your plan. How you thought it was going to go down, you're going to trust that God has a purpose and a plan for you. Right? David was anointed king. He was in the king's house. Everything was going to plan. The next step on David's plan was the throne, but the next step on God's plan was the cave. He didn't know that. He finds himself in the cave when he thought he was getting a throne. Some of you are mad at God because you thought you should have the throne by now, and that's the very reason why you have the cave, because there's some things that God's still working out in you so that when you get the throne, you're not going to shipwreck that thing. You know what I'm saying? There's still some unconquered territory that God is after. And so he brings you into a cave of trial that you might trust in him and that you come out of the cave transformed, ready for what he would have next for you. This made me think of just such an important part of my life. In fact, that's why we're here. I think most of you by now will know my previous life was in professional baseball. And so when we were kind of going through this, my wife and I were going through this change, this sort of, man, are we going to get out of baseball or not? It seems like we should get out. It seems like God is calling us out of this thing. Should we do that? And my wife, she would tell me, she would say, honey, he has something better for you planned. And that was so, like, how simple that is, how true that is, and how impossible that was for me to believe. It was impossible for me to believe. You have to understand something. I grew up around professional baseball. It was literally all I knew. It was literally the only thing I understood. If you've ever been in like a very strong subculture, like if you were in the military or something like that, it's all you know. It is literally your whole life, and you feel odd when you're in the real world, right? We'd come home from the season, and I'd have 3 or 4 months in the off season, and I didn't know how to act around normal other people. You just don't know. Your whole life is this one thing. And I grew up with it. My dad was in professional baseball, still is. And so for 26 years of my life, I was in this thing, and I was being asked to come out of this thing, and I didn't know how to do that thing. This was my plan. I was headed for the throne, and God said, I'm going to bring you into a cave instead. And she would tell me, she's like, God has something better for you, and this is the something better for me. I mean, he had a great plan for me. We're in this room together because of that plan that he had for me, but I had no idea that he was bringing me into that sort of place. And some of you are fighting back, you're pushing back, you're resisting God's purposes for you because you think your plans are better. They're not better. And trust is not you believing God will carry out your plans. Trust is you believing that he has a purpose for you, and nothing will thwart that plan. Nothing will keep God from carrying out the purposes that he has for you in your life for the sake of his kingdom and his glory. We believe that. We have to believe that. And so the cave, it reveals what you really depend on, what you really trust. The cave, it shows you the unconquered territory still left in your heart. And trust, the trust of God becomes this demonstration of your faith. You grow in your faith as God puts you into places of trial and trust where you have to depend more on him. I had to quote a Mumford & Sons song because they have a song called The Cave, and I had to quote it. Mumford, he sings this, he sounds like he swallowed a violin when he does it, but so come out of your cave walking on your hands, see the world hanging upside down. You can understand dependence when you know the Maker's land. When we walk out of the cave and we see the world with different eyes, we now know what trust looks like. We now know what it looks like to depend on God. And this is the great news of the cave. The cave is a place of trial and trust, but also of transformation. We don't know all that happened at the cave in 1 Samuel 22, but every commentator agrees David comes out of the cave a new man. That he experiences a sort of spiritual revival. And you can kind of get a taste of it a little bit in the psalm that he writes, right? In verse 6, he says, they set a net for my steps. My soul was bowed down. They dug a pit in my way, but they have fallen into it themselves. And then boom, his heart just begins to rejoice. Verse 7, my heart is steadfast. Oh God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody. Awake, my glory. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. He just begins to praise God. He's a new man. He's a new man. And he comes out of a cave, a new man, ready for what God would have for him. We need that. David, he needed this sort of spiritual retreat to be strengthened and ready for whatever God had next for him. Whatever cave you find yourself in, it's meant to strengthen you for whatever God has next. Believe that, trust that. That's true. It's just true. And so when God takes you into the wilderness, you don't come out the same. Ignatius of Loyola, he was the founder of the Jesuit movement. He was converted, he became a Christian during the Reformation and the Renaissance, like a time of great social change and chaos and turmoil, much like our day, where it's like, man, what is happening? Well, how do I look at the world, and what is true and what is real and what is transcendent? He was converted. He became a Christian in a day just like we are in today. And so when he became a Christian, he didn't know what to do with his life. Like many of you, your whole life changes, and you were headed in one direction, and now you don't know what direction you should go in. He didn't know. And so he began to wander around, like he sort of took a year off, I guess, a little gap year for Ignatius, and he finds himself in this Spanish town of Manresa. And he had no plan of staying there at all, but he ended up being there about, I think it was 11 months. And he found a cave in this small town of Manresa. And he found himself continually, regularly going out to this cave to spend time with the Lord. For 11 months, he would walk out of town and he would head to this cave. And it was in the cave that God began to break him down that he might be built up again. Not knowing what was next, not knowing what his purpose was, not knowing what the plan was next, he just found himself in this cave where God was building him up and tearing him down and conquering every territory of his heart. And I was thinking about this, like we can do that. You can almost, we find ourselves in cave moments, but we can also when you fast, you're putting yourself into the cave. When you get up early in the morning and you read your Bible, right? It's early, you've got a ton of things to do, but you're gonna spend time with God, you're gonna open up your word, you're gonna get into the cave of your quiet time, and God can begin to break you down and build you back up. Right? Fasting, it's like, I'm gonna be dependent on the Lord. I'm gonna trust, I don't need food, I'm gonna trust in him today because he's gonna be my strength. We can do that. We can let's not resist the cave moments. Let's even seek some of them out because that's the place of transformation. Here's what Ignatius said. I thought this was great. This is what the cave taught him. There are very few people, he said, who realize what God would make of them, if they abandoned themselves into his hands and let themselves be formed by his grace. Will you let yourself be formed by the grace of God? And here is the grace of God. David, he had a cave. David had a cave. Joseph had a prison. He also had a pit first. Moses had a desert. He also had a band of cave dwellers that were not very happy or fun to be around. Jeremiah had a pit. Daniel had a den. Paul was in and out of jail. You and I have our own little cave moments. Jesus had all of it. You think about like the cave moments that prepared Jesus for great work of ministry. What comes to mind? But he had his 40 days in the wilderness, 40 days of trial and temptation. Right before he's gonna start his 3-year ministry, the Spirit of God drives Jesus out to be tempted in his weakest moments by the devil. That's all preparation, spiritual strength, getting ready for the next 3 years. But then the thing that came to mind for me was the Garden of Gethsemane. Right? Jesus finds himself in the garden asking the Father, is this really the plan? Like, does the plan have to go this way? Could we let this cup pass from me? Is this the plan? Does it have to go down like this? Yet not my will, but your will be done. Right? So Jesus knows what it's like to be in your weakest moment, in the cave moments where you have to trust in God and trust that his plan, his purpose is good and right. He knows what that's like. But then also, even better than that, it's not just that Jesus can sympathize with whatever kind of cave moment you're in. Jesus frees us up to not have to get it right all the time. Jesus is the only one who's perfectly trusted the Father in his hardest moments, in his worst moments. Right? I think about Hebrews 11, we read it, but Hebrews 12, right after it lists all these people that have done these wonderful and also terribly hard things as they followed Jesus. In Hebrews 11, Hebrews 12 says that Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith. That it's Jesus alone who has perfectly trusted the Father in those difficult moments. And so we're freed up. Your salvation is not dependent on you getting it all right in whatever hard moment you find, whatever cave moment you find yourself in right now. You are freed up to love the Father. You are loved by God. You are freed up to wrestle through your doubts. You're freed up in all of this. You're freed up to embrace the cave moments, the moments where God has brought you to maybe the end of yourself. Maybe he's brought you to a place where you didn't think this was the plan, that you might just embrace that moment and ask God what trust looks like for you. Transformation happens in the cave. And so what cave are you in? What part of your heart maybe have you not given over to him? What does that look like? I want you to literally just respond to God personally in this moment right now. And so let me help you with that. Go ahead and posture yourself in whatever way you think you need to before God. Sometimes our body has to go in the way in which we want our heart to go. And so you may close your eyes, you may open them, you may open your hands, you may close them, you may find yourself on your knees. But I feel like it would be silly for us to just move right into a corporate response, Lord's Supper, prayers, songs, without first just a personal response. Before all the cave dwellers join us, what if just you and God have a moment? And so God, we just confess that there are parts of our hearts that are not given over to you right now. Or we confess that we don't understand your purpose for our lives. And we don't get why you would have us where we are. But in our doubt, we're going to run towards you. What does it look like for you right now, like Jesus, to just say, just to be honest, God, can this cup not pass from me? But then also like Jesus, but not my will be done. You will fulfill your purpose for me, oh God. And so I want you to just wrestle with the Lord, whatever place you're in. Let the Spirit of God minister to you, comfort you, meet you. Just put yourself in a little cave right now and trust that the Spirit of the Most High God is in that place. And there's something he wants to do in you. And you're not going to come out the same. And so God, I pray for my friends that you do a mighty work in them. God, would you be powerful in this place? In Jesus' name, amen.